He bought an entire island in the Bahamas, far from paparazzi, far from Hollywood noise. But what actually happens there is not what most people think. While rumors online paint wild pictures, the real story of Johnny Depp's private island is far more unexpected, and in some ways, more revealing about who he really is. No luxury parties every night, no secret celebrity gatherings every weekend. Instead, something much quieter, almost hidden in plain sight. And once you hear the truth, it completely changes how you see him. The island sits quietly in the Exumas, surrounded by water so clear it almost feels unreal, a place called Little Hulls Pond Cay, owned by Johnny Depp since 2004, purchased after years of searching for somewhere that didn't feel like the world he was constantly escaping. What most people imagine when they hear about a celebrity owning an island is non-stop luxury, loud gatherings, endless attention, but the reality here is almost the opposite. This place was never designed to impress anyone else. It was designed so he could finally disappear. He has openly talked about it in interviews, including one with Vanity Fair, where he described the first moment he saw the island as the first time he felt real calm in years. Not success, not fame, not awards, but silence. That matters because it explains everything that happens there. This island is not a display of wealth, it is a retreat from it. There are no massive resorts built across the land, no attempt to turn it into a business, no commercial expansion. Instead, the island remains intentionally simple, with small eco-friendly structures and minimal development that blends into the environment rather than dominating it. One of the most surprising facts is that each beach on the island is named after someone deeply personal in his life. There is a beach named after his daughter Lily Rose, another after his son Jack, and others inspired by people who influenced him, including Gonzo, a reference tied to Hunter S. Thompson, someone he deeply admired and portrayed on screen. This detail alone shows that the island is not about showing off, it is about memory, identity, and connection. It is almost like a physical map of his personal life, something that cannot be understood from the outside looking in. There are no constant celebrity parties happening there. In fact, multiple reports and interviews suggest the opposite. He spends time there in isolation, reading, painting, writing, and just existing without interruption. He has mentioned in interviews that he values being able to live without phones, without constant communication, without the pressure to respond to the outside world. That level of disconnection is rare, especially for someone whose entire career depends on visibility. What also makes this island different is the way it was built and maintained. Instead of creating something excessive, the focus has always been on preserving the natural state of the island. Solar power is used, and efforts have been made to keep the environment as untouched as possible. There is no attempt to turn it into a spectacle. It is almost hidden, both physically and metaphorically. You would not even realize the scale of ownership unless you were specifically told. And then there is the emotional layer that most people overlook. This island became especially important during difficult periods of his life. During times when public attention was intense and often negative, this place remained one of the few constants where he could step away completely. In court documents and public discussions during his legal battles, references were made to how he sought privacy and distance, and this island played a role in that escape. Not as a luxury getaway, but as a necessary separation from pressure. People expect something dramatic when they hear about a private island, but the truth is much quieter. There are no flashing cameras, no scheduled appearances, no performance. Just routine, simple living. Waking up without noise, walking across sand that has no footprints, spending hours without interruption. It sounds simple, but for someone who has spent decades in the spotlight, it is something almost impossible to find anywhere else. He has also spoken about how the island allows him to reconnect with creativity in a way that is not possible in cities or studios. Painting, music, and writing all become more natural there, not forced or scheduled. It becomes clear that the island is not an escape from work, but a different kind of space where creativity is not controlled by deadlines or expectations. That difference changes everything. There is also a strong sense of control tied to the island. In a world where most aspects of his life have been public, analyzed, and often misunderstood, this is one of the few places that remains entirely his. No media narrative, no outside interpretation, no intrusion. That level of ownership is not just physical, it is psychological. It represents a boundary that cannot be crossed, and despite all of this, the island is not completely cut off from reality. It still requires maintenance, still requires planning, still exists within the real world. But the way it is used is what makes it different. It is not about escaping responsibility. It is about choosing when and how to engage with the world. That choice is something most people never fully have. What makes the story even more interesting is how different it is from the image many people have built over time. Public perception often focuses on extremes, but this island shows a different side entirely. Not loud, not chaotic, not excessive, but controlled, intentional, and deeply personal. And the more you look into it, the more it becomes clear that the real surprise is not what happens there, but what does not happen there. No constant noise, no endless attention, no need to perform. Just space, silence, and time, something that cannot be bought in most places, but somehow exists here. And that is where the story starts to shift even further. Because once you understand what this island truly is, the next question becomes even more unexpected. Why he chose this kind of life in the first place, and what it reveals about everything that came before it. Because this choice did not come out of nowhere. It was shaped over years of living inside a system that rarely slows down, where every move is watched, every word is analyzed, and every mistake becomes permanent in the public eye. For Johnny Depp, the contrast between that world and the island could not be more extreme. In multiple interviews, including conversations published by Rolling Stone and Vanity Fair, he described how constant exposure can slowly take away a sense of self, how noise builds up to a point where silence becomes something you actively search for rather than something that naturally exists. The island became that answer, but not in the way people expect. It was not about running away from everything. It was about creating a space where things could return to a natural pace. There are no strict schedules there, no forced structure, no external pressure to produce anything. Days are shaped by light, weather, and mood rather than obligations. This kind of environment changes how a person thinks over time. Instead of reacting, you begin to observe. Instead of performing, you begin to exist without an audience. One of the details that stands out is how rarely the island is used for social gatherings. While friends and close family have visited, it is not a place designed for large groups or constant entertainment. This is consistent with what he has said publicly about valuing small, meaningful connections over large, performative ones. It also aligns with how the island itself is structured. There are no massive villas designed to host dozens of people at once. Everything remains intentionally limited, almost as if the space is designed to prevent excess rather than encourage it. There is also a creative dimension that becomes more visible the more you look into it. Away from studios and production timelines, creativity becomes something quieter and more personal. He has spoken about painting extensively, and some of his artwork has been directly influenced by time spent in isolation. This is not speculation, it is something he has confirmed in interviews and public appearances. The island acts almost like a reset point, where ideas are not shaped by expectations but by experience. Music, writing, and visual art all become part of daily life, not as tasks, but as natural expressions. Another important element is how the island reflects a need for control over environment. In cities, especially in places like Los Angeles or London, there is always movement, always unpredictability. Here, everything is stable. The same shoreline, the same quiet, the same absence of interruption. This consistency becomes a form of grounding. It is not about isolation for the sake of being alone. It is about having a space where nothing unexpected is forced upon you during periods of intense public attention, especially around legal disputes that were widely covered across media platforms. The importance of that stability became even clearer. While details of those situations were discussed openly in courtrooms and reported globally, the island remained one of the few places untouched by that noise. It was never presented as an escape in official statements, but the pattern is visible. When pressure increased, distance became necessary, and this location provided that distance in a way no other place could. It is also worth noting how consistent his descriptions of the island have been over time. In different interviews across years, the core message does not change. He talks about quiet, about simplicity, about the absence of chaos. There is no shift toward exaggeration or spectacle. This consistency adds credibility to the idea that the island is exactly what it appears to be, not something hidden behind a different reality. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is the way time functions differently there. Without constant digital connection, without the need to check updates or respond instantly, time slows down. This is something he has mentioned directly, describing how days feel longer, how moments become more noticeable. This shift is subtle but significant. It changes priorities, changes focus, and changes how experiences are processed. There is also a physical aspect to this environment that cannot be ignored. Being surrounded by water, away from urban noise, has a measurable effect on how the mind responds. This is not a claim specific to him. It is something supported by broader observations about isolation and natural environments. But in this case, it becomes part of a larger pattern. The island is not just a location. It is a system that supports a different way of living, and yet, despite all of this, the island is not completely disconnected from reality. Supplies need to be brought in, maintenance needs to be handled, and there is still a structure behind the scenes that keeps everything functioning. But even that is managed in a way that does not disrupt the overall experience. Everything is kept minimal, controlled, and out of focus. What makes this even more interesting is how it contrasts with public assumptions. People often expect extremes, especially when it comes to wealth and privacy. But here, the extreme is actually the absence of excess. No overdevelopment, no attempt to turn the island into a brand, no visible effort to monetize it. It remains personal, almost private in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental. There have also been documented moments where journalists or publications have described the island based on verified visits or confirmed details. These descriptions align closely with what he has said himself. Quiet beaches, limited structures, and a focus on preserving the natural landscape. There is no contradiction between public statements and observed reality, which is rare in situations like this. As you continue to look deeper, the island starts to feel less like a luxury and more like a boundary. A line drawn between two very different versions of life. One that is constantly visible and one that is completely private. That boundary is what gives the island its real value. Not the land itself, not the location, but the separation it creates, and that separation leads to a deeper question about identity. When someone spends enough time in isolation, away from external influence, what remains becomes more authentic. There is no need to maintain an image, no need to adjust behavior based on expectations. What exists is closer to reality, even if it is rarely seen by others. This is where the story becomes even more revealing, because the island does not just show how he lives, it shows what he chooses to remove from his life. Noise, pressure, constant visibility, and the need to explain himself. All of those things disappear there, and what remains is something much simpler but also much harder to achieve in any other environment. And once you understand that, the idea of the island changes completely. It is no longer about curiosity or mystery, it becomes about intention. Every detail, from the way it is built to the way it is used, points toward a very specific purpose. Not to impress, not to escape completely, but to create a space where life can exist without interference. And that is exactly where the next part of the story begins to unfold. Because when you look at how that space is protected and maintained over time, it reveals something even more unexpected about how far he is willing to go to keep that separation intact. That separation does not just happen on its own. It requires constant decisions, constant boundaries, and a level of discipline that most people never think about when they imagine a private island. For Johnny Depp, maintaining that environment means actively choosing what is allowed in and what is kept out. This is not about isolation in a dramatic sense. It is about control over energy, over noise, over the kind of life that is allowed to exist within that space. One of the most overlooked aspects is how carefully access to the island is managed. This is not a place where people can just arrive freely. Every visit is intentional, every guest is known, and every moment is shaped by the controlled environment. There are no surprise appearances, no random events, no external chaos entering the space. This level of control creates a consistency that is almost impossible to achieve anywhere else in the world. He has never presented the island as something secretive in a suspicious way, but rather as something personal that does not need to be explained. In past interviews, he has been open about the fact that privacy is not about hiding something, it is about having something that belongs only to you. That distinction is important, because it shifts the narrative away from mystery and toward ownership of personal space. There is also a rhythm to life there that becomes more visible the longer you look at it. Mornings are not rushed. There is no urgency to check messages or respond to obligations. Time is shaped by natural cues rather than external demands. This might sound simple, but for someone whose schedule has been dictated by film productions, press tours, and global travel, It represents a complete shift in how life is experienced. The environment itself plays a role in reinforcing that rhythm. The absence of city noise, the presence of open water, and the natural isolation all contribute to a kind of mental clarity that is difficult to replicate. This is not a claim based on assumption. It is something he has described directly when talking about how the island affects his state of mind. The clarity, the calm, and the ability to think without interruption are all part of what makes the place meaningful. Another detail that adds to the authenticity of this story is how consistent the island's purpose has remained over time. There has been no shift toward commercialization, no attempt to turn it into a public destination, no visible change in how it is used. Years have passed, and yet the core idea remains exactly the same. This consistency suggests that the island was never meant to evolve into something else. It was created with a specific intention, and that intention has been maintained without compromise. There is also a deeper layer tied to trust. When a space is that private, the people who are allowed into it become part of the trust system. This is not about status or fame, it is about connection and reliability. Those who visit are not there for spectacle, they are there because they are part of a smaller, more personal circle. This creates an environment where interactions are genuine rather than performative. What makes this even more interesting is how the island contrasts with the idea of access that is often associated with wealth. Instead of expanding, instead of adding more structures or features, the focus has remained on restraint. This is a choice, not a limitation. It shows that the value of the island is not in how much can be built on it, but in how much can be left untouched. There have been references in credible publications and interviews where the simplicity of the island has been confirmed by those who have either visited or discussed it with direct knowledge. These accounts align with everything that has been said publicly. No contradiction, no hidden layer that changes the story. This alignment between different sources adds to the reliability of the narrative. And then there is the psychological impact of having a place that is entirely yours. Not rented, not shared, not temporary, but owned in a way that allows complete control over how it is used. This creates a sense of stability that goes beyond physical space. It becomes a constant in a life that has otherwise been unpredictable and often chaotic. During periods when public narratives have been intense and sometimes conflicting, having that constant becomes even more important. It provides a reference point, a place that does not change based on public opinion or media coverage. This is not something that is often discussed openly, but it is something that becomes clear when you look at patterns over time. Another aspect that stands out is how the island removes the need for explanation. In most parts of life, especially in the public eye, there is always a need to clarify, to respond, to correct. Here, that need disappears completely. There is no audience, no expectation, no requirement to justify anything. This absence of explanation is one of the most powerful elements of true privacy. As you continue to understand how this space functions, it becomes clear that the real surprise is not hidden events or secret activities. It is the complete lack of them. Nothing dramatic is happening there, and that is exactly the point. The absence of chaos is what makes it unique. This also changes how success itself is perceived. Instead of being measured by visibility or recognition, it is measured by control over one's own life. The ability to step away, to disconnect, and to exist without external pressure becomes the real form of success. This perspective is rarely shown, but it becomes obvious when looking at how the island is used. And there is something else that becomes clear over time. The island is not just a reaction to fame, it is a reflection of personal values that existed long before it was purchased. The appreciation for art, for quiet, for introspection, all of these elements were already part of who he was. The island simply gave those elements a space to exist without interference. This is supported by interviews where he has spoken about his interests outside of acting, including music and painting, long before the island became part of his life. The consistency between those interests and how the island is used shows that this is not a constructed image. It is an extension of an existing identity, and as the story continues to unfold, it becomes even more clear that the island is not the most important part of this narrative. What matters more is what it represents. A deliberate choice to live differently, to define success on personal terms, and to create a space where that definition can exist without compromise. Because once you reach that point of understanding, the final layer of this story becomes impossible to ignore, and it reveals something even more unexpected about how this private world connects back to everything happening outside of it. Because no matter how isolated that world may seem, it still exists alongside a public life that never fully stops. and the contrast is where the full picture finally becomes clear. For Johnny Depp, the island is not a replacement for reality, it is a counterbalance to it. Everything that happens outside continues to exist: projects, public appearances, legal matters, conversations in media, all of it moves forward, but the island remains unchanged, almost like a fixed point in the middle of constant movement. This is where the deeper meaning begins to connect. When someone has access to both extremes, total visibility and complete privacy, the way they choose to move between those two worlds says more than anything they could explain in words. He does not stay on the island permanently, and that matters. It shows that the goal is not to disappear entirely, but to control when to engage and when to step away. That balance is what most people never fully achieve. In documented interviews over the years, including discussions around his approach to fame, he has made it clear that attention was never the end goal. Acting was about characters, about storytelling, about transformation, not about becoming a permanent public figure under constant observation. But success changes that, and over time, the public side of life becomes unavoidable. The island, in the context, becomes a way to reconnect with the original purpose, away from everything that came with it later. There is also a noticeable difference in how time spent on the island influences what happens afterward. While he has not described this in overly technical terms, the pattern is visible. Periods of distance are often followed by renewed creative output, whether in film, music, or art. This does not mean the island creates the work, but it creates the conditions where ideas can exist without pressure, which eventually carries over into the outside world. Another element that stands out is how the island removes hierarchy. In public spaces, there is always structure, status, expectations based on who someone is. On the island, that disappears. There is no need to maintain an image, no difference between public identity and private self. This kind of environment changes interactions, making them more direct, more real, and less influenced by external perception. This is supported by accounts from interviews where he has described feeling most like himself in environments where there is no expectation to perform. The island becomes one of those environments, not because it is isolated, but because it is free from the systems that normally define behavior. This distinction is subtle but important. There is also a long-term perspective that becomes visible when you look at how the island has been maintained over decades. Nothing about it suggests temporary escape or short-term use. Everything points toward permanence, toward creating something that will remain consistent regardless of what happens outside. This kind of thinking is different from typical luxury purchases, which often change or evolve based on trends or new interests. The island does not follow trends. It does not adapt to public expectations. It stays exactly what it was intended to be from the beginning. That stability becomes part of its value, not just financially, but psychologically. It is something that does not shift, does not react, and does not depend on anything else to exist. Another layer that becomes clear is how the island reflects a rejection of constant connectivity. In a world where being available at all times has become normal, choosing to step away completely is a deliberate decision. He has mentioned in interviews that being unreachable can be necessary, not as avoidance, but as a way to protect focus and mental space. The island provides that in a way that no city or controlled environment can fully replicate. This also changes how relationships are experienced. Communication becomes more intentional, more direct, and less frequent in a way that increases its value. Interactions are not driven by convenience, they are driven by choice. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not influenced by constant updates or background noise. There is also an important distinction between privacy and isolation that becomes clear through this story. Privacy is about control, about choosing what to share and what to keep. Isolation, on the other hand, is often seen as disconnection. The island represents privacy, not isolation. It is not about cutting off from everything. It is about creating a space where connection happens on your own terms. This idea is reinforced by the fact that he continues to work, continues to appear in public, continues to engage with projects and collaborations. The island does not remove him from the world, it allows him to return to it with a clearer sense of direction. That difference is what makes the entire situation more grounded and real. And when you look at everything together, the location, the way it is built, the way it is used, the consistency over time, and the alignment with what he has said in interviews, the picture becomes very clear. There is no hidden story, no secret activity, no unexpected twist that changes everything. The truth is much simpler, and that simplicity is what makes it surprising. People expect complexity, especially when it comes to wealth and privacy, but here the opposite is true. The simplicity is intentional, and it is maintained with the same level of care that others might use to build something more visible. This is not about having more, it is about needing less, and that leads to the final realization. The island is not the story on its own, it is a reflection of a larger decision about how to live. A decision to step away from constant noise, to protect personal space, and to create an environment where life can exist without being shaped by external pressure. What happens there is not dramatic, it is not hidden, and it is not designed to impress anyone. What happens there is quiet, consistent, and real. And in a world where everything is constantly changing, that might be the most unexpected thing of all. And when everything is brought together, the island stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like a statement, not something loud or designed to attract attention, but something steady that exists whether anyone is looking at it or not. For Johnny Depp, that quiet consistency becomes the most important detail of all, because it reflects a kind of control that cannot be easily seen from the outside. What makes this even more clear is how little the story has changed over time. In an industry where narratives constantly shift, where public perception moves quickly and often unpredictably, the island has remained exactly the same. The purpose has not been redefined, the space has not been reshaped to match trends, and the way it is used has not been altered to fit expectations. That level of consistency is not accidental. It is maintained through continuous choice. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form when you consider how rare this kind of setup actually is. Many people have access to luxury, but very few use it to create simplicity. The common pattern is expansion, adding more, building more, showing more. Here, the pattern is the opposite. Less noise, fewer structures, minimal presence. That reversal challenges the usual idea of what success looks like. He has spoken in past interviews about how early experiences shaped his perspective on life, including a preference for quieter environments and a tendency to avoid unnecessary attention even before his career reached its highest level. Those details matter because they show that the island is not a reaction to fame alone. It is something that aligns with long-standing personal preferences. There is also a noticeable difference in how time spent there influences decision-making outside of it. While this is not something that is always directly stated, the pattern can be observed. Stepping away from constant input allows for clearer thinking, and the clarity affects choices when returning to work or public life. It creates a separation between reaction and intention, which is something that is difficult to maintain in fast-paced environments. Another important detail is how the island removes the concept of urgency. In most parts of life, especially in high-visibility careers, everything feels immediate. Responses are expected quickly, decisions are made under pressure, and time is always limited. On the island, that urgency disappears. Things happen at their own pace, without the need to rush. This shift changes how problems are approached and how solutions are found. This environment also reinforces independence. Without constant access to external input, decisions become more self-directed. There is less influence from outside opinions, less pressure to align with expectations, and more space to rely on personal judgment. This independence is not about rejecting others. It is about strengthening internal clarity. There have also been consistent references in credible publications that confirm the island's minimal development and private use, aligning with everything that has been described publicly. Journalists who have written about it, based on verified information, consistently describe the same core elements: untouched landscapes, small-scale structures, and a focus on maintaining the natural environment. This alignment across sources strengthens the reliability of the overall picture. And then there is the idea of permanence. Unlike many aspects of life that change over time, the island represents something fixed. It is not dependent on public opinion, not influenced by trends, and not affected by shifting narratives. It remains the same regardless of what happens elsewhere. That stability creates a foundation that is rare in a life that has often been anything but stable. This also leads to a different understanding of value. Instead of measuring worth through visibility or recognition, the value here is measured through control, privacy, and consistency. It is about having something that does not need to be explained or displayed to have meaning. That kind of value is not always visible, but it is deeply significant. Another layer that becomes clear is how the island allows for reflection without interruption. In most environments, even moments of quiet are temporary, often interrupted by notifications, obligations, or external demands. Here, reflection can continue without disruption, allowing thoughts to develop fully rather than being cut short. This creates a different depth of thinking, one that is harder to achieve in more connected environments. There is also a strong connection between the island and authenticity. Without the need to maintain a public image, actions and choices become more aligned with personal values rather than external expectations. This authenticity is not something that is performed. It is something that naturally exists when there is no audience to respond to. This becomes especially important when considering how public figures are often defined by perception rather than reality. The island creates a space where that perception has no influence, where identity is not shaped by headlines or commentary. It allows for a version of life that is closer to truth, even if the truth is rarely seen by others. And yet, despite all of this separation, the connection to the outside world is never completely lost. Work continues, projects move forward, and interactions still happen. The difference is that these things are approached from a place of clarity rather than pressure. The island does not remove responsibility. It changes how responsibility is experienced. This balance between two very different worlds becomes the most defining aspect of the entire story. On one side, constant visibility, public narratives, and ongoing attention. On the other, complete privacy, silence, and control. The ability to move between these two spaces is what makes the situation unique, and when you look at it from that perspective, the island is no longer just a location. It becomes a tool, a way to manage the demands of a life that exists at a very high level of visibility. It provides a reset point, a place where everything can slow down before returning to a faster pace. What also stands out is how intentional every aspect of this setup appears to be. Nothing feels accidental, nothing feels exaggerated, and nothing feels out of place. Every detail supports the same core idea, creating a space where life can exist without unnecessary interference, and that is where the final understanding settles in, not as a dramatic revelation, but as something much simpler and more grounded. The island is not about what happens there, it is about what is allowed to happen there, and more importantly, what is not. No constant noise, no pressure to perform, no need to explain, no expectation to maintain an image. Just space, time, and the freedom to exist without interruption. And in a world that rarely stops moving, that kind of stillness becomes the most surprising thing of all. And when you look at that stillness over a longer period of time, it starts to reveal something even deeper about how a person can reshape their entire relationship with the world around them. For Johnny Depp, the island is not just a place to pause, it becomes a place where perspective is rebuilt, where the constant pressure of reaction is replaced with the ability to observe without urgency. This is where the difference between escape and recalibration becomes clear. Escape is temporary and often driven by avoidance, but what happens here is more structured, more intentional. It is about stepping away long enough to return with clarity, not disappearing completely. This pattern has been reflected in how he has described his need for distance in various interviews, where the focus is not on leaving everything behind, but on creating space to think without interruption. There is also a noticeable shift in how priorities are organized when that kind of environment becomes part of life. Things that once felt urgent begin to lose that intensity, while things that were often ignored gain more importance. Time spent in quiet reflection, creative expression, and simple routines becomes more valuable than constant activity. This shift is not dramatic on the surface, but over time it changes how decisions are made. Another element that stands out is how the island allows for a different kind of discipline. Without external schedules, structure has to come from within. There are no deadlines forcing action, no external systems creating pressure. This means that whatever is done there is chosen, not required. That distinction changes the meaning of productivity, turning it into something personal rather than something measured by output. This is supported by consistent references to his creative work outside of major productions. Painting, music, and writing are not treated as secondary activities. They are part of daily life in a way that is not controlled by industry expectations. The island provides a space where these forms of expression can exist without needing validation or recognition. There is also a strong connection between that environment and emotional balance. Constant exposure to public opinion can create a cycle where reactions become automatic, where responses are shaped by external narratives rather than internal understanding. The island interrupts that cycle. It creates a pause between input and response, allowing for a more measured approach to everything that follows. This becomes especially important when considering how public narratives can shift quickly and sometimes inaccurately. Having a place that is completely separate from that process allows for a different kind of stability. It provides a reminder that not everything needs to be addressed immediately, and not every situation requires a reaction. Another layer that becomes visible is how the island changes the perception of ownership itself. It is not about possessing something to display it. It is about having a space that functions in a very specific way. The value is not in what others see, but in how it is experienced. This is a different way of thinking about ownership, one that is less focused on visibility and more focused on purpose. There have been multiple instances where credible sources have confirmed the simplicity and privacy of the island, aligning with everything that has been described publicly. These confirmations are important because they remove speculation and reinforce the idea that the reality matches the narrative. There is no hidden contradiction, no alternate version of events that changes the story, and as that consistency continues, it becomes clear that the island is not something that exists separately from the rest of life. It is integrated into it in a very specific way. It acts as a counterweight, balancing out the demands of a highly visible career with a space that is completely private. This balance is not accidental. It is maintained through continuous choice. There is also an interesting shift in how success is defined when viewed through this lens. Instead of focusing on external achievements, the focus moves toward internal stability. The ability to control one's environment, to choose when to engage and when to step back, becomes a more meaningful measure of success than recognition alone. This perspective is not often highlighted, but it becomes very clear when looking at how the island is used. It is not about adding more to life, it is about removing what is unnecessary. That process of reduction creates space for what actually matters, whether that is creativity, reflection, or simply time without interruption. Another important detail is how the island allows for continuity. In a life where projects start and end, where roles change, and where public perception evolves, the island remains constant. It does not shift with each new phase. It stays the same regardless of external changes. This continuity provides a sense of grounding that is difficult to replicate in other areas of life. This also influences how challenges are approached. With distance comes perspective, and with perspective comes the ability to see situations more clearly. Instead of reacting immediately, there is space to consider different angles, to process information fully before responding. This leads to more deliberate decisions rather than impulsive ones. And then there is the idea of legacy, not in the traditional sense of public achievements, but in terms of personal choices. The island represents a decision about how to live, about what to prioritize, and about what to leave behind. It is not something that needs to be explained or justified. It simply exists as a reflection of those choices. As everything comes together, the story reaches a point where the initial curiosity is completely transformed. What started as a question about what happens on a private island becomes an understanding of why it exists in the first place. The answer is not hidden. It is simply quieter than expected. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, nothing designed to shock. Just a consistent, intentional way of living that prioritizes privacy, clarity, and control over noise, pressure, and constant visibility. And in a world where attention is often treated as the most valuable thing, choosing to step away from it becomes the most unexpected move of all. And when you step back and look at the full picture from beginning to end, the island stops being a question and starts becoming an answer, not just to curiosity, but to a much larger problem that most people never even realize they are part of. For Johnny Depp, the constant exposure, the expectations, and the pressure to always be visible created a situation where silence itself became rare. And that is exactly what this place restores in the most direct way possible. There is something important about how that silence works. It is not empty. It is not just the absence of sound. It is a space where thoughts are not interrupted before they can fully form. In everyday life, especially in environments driven by constant updates and immediate responses, thoughts are often cut short, redirected, or replaced before they have time to develop. On the island, that interruption does not exist, and that changes the entire experience of thinking itself. This is where the idea of clarity becomes more than just a simple concept. Clarity is not something that can be forced. It requires space, and that space is exactly what the island provides. Without constant input, without the need to react instantly, there is time to process things completely. This leads to decisions that are not driven by urgency, but by understanding. Another layer that becomes clear is how the island changes the relationship with attention. Attention in the public world is often something that is chased, measured, and managed. Here, it is irrelevant. There is no audience to impress, no performance to maintain, no need to stay visible. That shift removes an entire layer of pressure that most people in similar positions never fully escape. He has spoken in interviews about how being alone in a natural environment allowed him to reconnect with parts of himself that are often overshadowed by public life. This is not presented as something dramatic or exaggerated, but as something simple and necessary. The island becomes a place where identity is not influenced by perception, where it can exist without being shaped by external narratives. There is also a deeper sense of patience that develops in that environment. Without constant deadlines or expectations, time is no longer something that needs to be managed aggressively. Instead, it becomes something that can be experienced fully. This patience affects everything, from how ideas are developed to how problems are approached. And then there is the physical presence of the island itself, something that cannot be fully explained through words alone. The repetition of waves, the stillness of early mornings, the gradual shift of light throughout the day, all of these elements create a rhythm that is completely different from anything found in a city. This rhythm becomes part of daily life, influencing mood, focus, and overall perspective. There have been consistent confirmations from interviews and credible reports that this environment is not exaggerated, that the simplicity and privacy described are accurate reflections of reality. These confirmations matter because they remove doubt and reinforce the idea that what is being described is not a constructed image, but an actual way of living. Another important detail is how the island allows for a complete break from digital dependency. Without constant connectivity, the need to check, respond, and stay updated disappears. This is not about rejecting technology entirely, but about choosing when it is allowed to exist. That level of control changes how information is consumed and how attention is directed. This also creates a different relationship with creativity. Without external pressure, creativity becomes more fluid, more natural, and less restricted. Ideas are not shaped by deadlines or expectations. They are allowed to develop at their own pace. This leads to a different kind of output, one that is more personal and less influenced by external demands. There is also a strong connection between the island and emotional resilience.